In June 2026, you could buy a human life at sea for exactly
Yeah,
$10,400.
which is just, it's a staggering baseline figure.
It really is. Today, we are looking at this massive investigation published in the Maritime Journal, the DeepDraft. And the mission of this deep dive is to bridge a sick, massive gap between two completely different realities.
Right, because on one hand, you have the photos from Posidonia 2026.
Yeah, the huge biannual Maritime Expo in Athens. You look at these images, and it's all, high gloss, pristine booths, executives in these tailored suits networking, drinking espresso under the bright lights.
Basically celebrating the immense wealth of global shipping.
Exactly.
But then you look at the unclassified black and white thermal imagery from the Gulf of Oman taken that exact same month.
Yeah.
Specifically the MT Settebello. It's this commercial tanker just spewing a catastrophic, towering plume of black smoke into the sky after a direct missile strike.
The distance between that polished expo booth in Greece and a burning engine room in the Middle East is the subject of today's analysis. Yeah.
We are going to strip away the clinical language of military briefings. We're going to look past those passive regulatory PDFs issued by shipping authorities, and we're going to unpack the gritty, lethal consequences for the civilian seafarers caught in these geopolitical crossfires.
Right. And I think we need to start this by actually saying the names of the 3 Indian nationals who were killed aboard that Palo-flagged Settebello on June 14th.
Yes, absolutely. Chief Engineer Patnala Suresh, Fitter Shivanand Chaurashia, and Cadet Aditya Sharma. I mean, these were not combatants. They were working-class civilians.
Which is exactly why the language used to describe their deaths requires such intense scrutiny, because, the words we use in official reports, they dictate how the public processes a tragedy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because reading the official CETCOM narrative, the U.S. military Central Command statement,
Right.
you would barely know human beings were even involved. They characterized the strike by an FA-18 Super Hornet from the USS Abraham Lincoln as a tactical measure to disable propulsion. Yeah, and they stated that the aircraft targeted the ship's engineering spaces.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how military nomenclature naturally sanitizes the application of lethal force.
Oh, for sure.
When a briefing uses a phrase like, tactical disablement from the air,
Yeah.
it projects this image of bloodless asset denial.
It sounds totally surgical, like you are simply unplugging a machine to stop a vehicle from moving forward into restricted waters.
Exactly.
But I have to push back on that clinical phrasing, because when you read through the source material, you realize a commercial tanker's engine room is not some, empty machinery box.
Right. It's not the engine compartment of a car.
No, where the metal block is safely tucked under a hood, totally away from the passenger cabin. I mean, if you shoot a car engine, the car rolls to a stop, but the driver is relatively shielded.
Yeah, but the architecture of the ship is fundamentally different. An engine room on a vessel the size of the Settebello is this massive multi-story workspace. It spans several decks, and at any given moment during operations, it is heavily manned by the engineering crew.
And the text lists what is actually inside that space. You've got active electrical generators, high-pressure fuel lines, boilers, massive purifiers.
Bunker tanks holding thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil.
Right. You have people working on metal grates surrounded by all of this at like 100 decibels. Hitting that specific crowded area with high explosive aviation ordnance is not a clean strategic disruption.
No, not at all.
You are deliberately introducing a spark into a powder keg.
Yeah, because when high explosives meet high-pressure fuel lines, the result is an inescapable inferno. I mean, the pilot at the end of that strike chain sees a mobility kill on a screen.
Yeah.
But down on the deck, you are deploying lethal force into a manned civilian workplace.
And, because these strikes don't just happen in a vacuum, we really have to look at the timeline. If the Settebello was just one terrible, isolated miscalculation, that would be an absolute tragedy. But the article lays out what it calls the 3-ship crisis. And this just destroys the industry narrative that seafarers are just occasionally wandering into bad luck.
Yeah, the timeline is the smoking gun for a systemic pipeline. Between June 8 and June 11, 3 separate tankers, all entirely crewed by Indian nationals, were struck by U.S. forces in the Gulf of Oman.
Wow.
You had the MT Marivex, the MT Settebello, and the MT Jalvir. The Settebello was the only one with fatalities, but all three faced catastrophic damage.
And the source material actually quotes the distress audio from the first ship, the Marifex, and it just strips away all that sterile military jargon instantly.
It really does.
The radio call is just, "This is tanker Marifex. We have fire on board. We have fire on board, and vessel is sinking."
Yeah.
You hear that, and you realize these are civilians desperately trying to save their own lives.
Yeah.
But wait, I'm genuinely struggling with this. If you are an Indian seafarer and you see on the news or, hear through the grapevine that vessels are getting hit with missiles,
Right.
why are you getting on the next ship? If 3 ships are hit in 4 days, why not just refuse the contract?
Well, that assumes the seafarer is operating from a position of commercial leverage, which is rarely the case. The industry frequently points to a signed waiver and calls it informed consent.
Oh, like they knew what they were signing up for?
Exactly. They argue the crew knew the risks. But we have to look at the economic mechanics of recruitment in places like Mumbai or Manila. A seafarer who has been sitting at home for 6 months without an income, watching his family's savings drain, is under immense economic coercion.
So when a manning agent calls and says, "Hey, I have a berth for you, but you leave tomorrow, and you have to sign this high-risk area waiver," it's not really a negotiation.
It is an ultimatum. Signing that document isn't true consent, it is desperation. And more importantly, let's look at what that waiver actually accomplishes.
Right.
It doesn't put a missile defense system on the ship. It doesn't guarantee the vessel has the proper insurance. All a waiver does is legally transfer the liability of operating in a war zone from the wealthy executives sitting in an air-conditioned office ashore down to the working-class casualties below deck.
Wow. And because those waivers effectively strip the crew of their protections, we really have to ask who is actually pulling the strings on shore, right? Who is feeding these crews their information? Because the truth of what led the Settebello into those crosshairs is violently contested. And just to be clear to you listening, we are going to look at these conflicting reports completely impartially. The goal here isn't to solve the intelligence puzzle. It's to show the utter chaos the crew was trapped inside.
Right, because the intelligence picture provided in the text is entirely fractured.
Yeah, on one side you have the U.S. military stance. They view these strikes as strict compliance enforcement against vessels violating international sanctions, essentially accusing the ship of participating in the illicit transport of Iranian oil. But on the exact opposite side, you have the ship's manager, this company based in Dubai, called IOS Marine FZE, who publicly and totally rejected CNTCOM's account. They completely denied any links to Iranian oil, and they explicitly stated they received absolutely 0 naval radio warnings prior to the strike.
But then the narrative splinters a third time.
Right.
Because accounts attributed to the family of Aditya Sharma, the deceased cadet, suggest that the vessel actually did receive prior warnings from the U.S. Navy before the fatal strike occurred.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because in the middle of all this geopolitical finger-pointing between a superpower navy and a Dubai management firm, the maritime system has a very specific default mechanism for assigning blame.
Yeah, it points the finger at the captain.
The master of the ship. The article notes that Arsenio Dominguez, he's the Secretary General of the IMO, which is the UN agency that regulates global shipping, stated that the ship's master bears the ultimate responsibility for voyage planning and risk assessments.
Which is a principle known as the master's trap.
Yeah, I read that quote, and my mind immediately went to a retail analogy. I mean, blaming the captain for this feels like blaming the shift manager of a single retail store for a massive global supply chain collapse that was secretly orchestrated by a corrupt CEO.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. The shift manager just unlocked the doors. They didn't buy the inventory.
And that is exactly how the architecture of a gray fleet operates. And just to clarify, when we say gray fleet, we're talking about vessels operating in the shadows of international trade.
Right.
They often fly flags of convenience. They hide their true ownership behind these layers of shell companies. And they specialize in moving sanctioned goods. So in that environment, what does a captain actually control?
Well, according to the regulations, everything on board.
Physically on board, yes. But commercially, nothing. The master does not structure the brass plate shell company in Panama that technically owns the vessel.
Right, they don't buy the insurance policies.
They don't negotiate the charter party, and they certainly don't pick the cargo. Because of how maritime law works, a billionaire owner can remain legally invisible behind a shell corporation.
Wow.
So the master standing on the bridge is often the only physical, recognizable legal entity that authorities can actually grab. They inherit this massive geopolitical risk, entirely created by people safely ashore.
And the source material calls out this massive double standard. The maritime system micromanages the captain. It tracks crew rest hours, fire drill logs, emissions checklists down to the minute.
Yeah, everything.
But when the real lethal danger is created above the ship by the owners deciding to run a blockade, the system suddenly throws its hands up and says, well, the captain is in command.
Command is real, but authority without commercial control is just an illusion. You cannot use the tradition of the captain's command as a shield to protect decisions made in a boardroom in Dubai.
Because the boardroom never faces the consequences. The confrontation inevitably happens at sea. The system ashore fails, which forces a violent clash between military blockade enforcement and civilian rights. And that brings us to the concept of tactical proportionality.
Yeah, this is a foundational legal and ethical framework. Under the San Remo Manual, which is the international law governing armed conflicts at sea, military forces have a strict binding requirement to take feasible precautions to safeguard civilian life.
Right.
You cannot just treat a commercial vessel like a purely military target. The major international shipping bodies, groups like the ICS and BIMCO, issued a joint declaration reinforcing one undeniable truth: seafarers are civilians.
Which prompts a really challenging question about military tactics. And again, we are looking at this purely through the impartial lens of tactical proportionality raised by the DeepDraft and international maritime bodies.
Yeah.
The United States possesses one of the most highly capable, technologically advanced naval forces on the planet.
Yeah.
If a civilian vessel is suspected of breaking sanctions, they have a massive menu of non-lethal options.
Absolutely.
They can hail the ship on the radio, they can shadow it with drones, they can physically insert a team to board and detain the vessel, or they can just escort it to a friendly port. So why bypass all of those physical interventions and go straight to firing high-explosive ordnance into an occupied engineering space?
Because the calculus of enforcement shifted, and that shift completely ignored the human element. Suspicion of cargo origin, even if perfectly accurate, does not magically convert a civilian fitter into an enemy combatant.
Right.
A regulatory non-compliance issue regarding oil sanctions does not strip a deck cadet of his civilian legal protections under international law. Bypassing non-lethal interdiction to drop explosives into a manned machinery deck raises profound legal questions.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the diplomatic shockwaves of those choices were massive. We are not just analyzing a localized skirmish here. We are talking about India, a nation that supplies well over 300,000 seafarers to the global maritime fleet.
Yeah, they are the backbone of global shipping labor. The diplomatic signal India sent was impossible to ignore. In direct response to the deaths of their citizens, India's Ministry of External Affairs, the MEA, summoned the U.S. Charge d'Affaires Jason Meeks.
Right.
And the reporting indicates he wasn't just summoned once. He was brought in twice as these attacks continued to receive very strong formal protests from the Indian government.
So you have this intense, high-level diplomatic standoff, nations summoning ambassadors, citing international law, and then the source material forces us to zoom all the way back down from the geopolitical stratosphere to the deeply personal financial realities left in the wake of this disaster.
Yeah, it provides the starkest possible metric of how the global supply chain actually values the human beings that keep it running.
So what does this all mean? Let's look at the numbers. We started by talking about the Posidonia Expo. Executives networking, closing deals, surrounded by gleaming technology. In that exact same month, the bereaved families of the 3 Settebello casualties were promised compensation. The figure promised to them from a state-backed welfare fund was 1 million Indian rupees each. That converts to roughly $10,400 US.
It is a staggering, almost incomprehensible contrast. You have an industry that measures its daily freight rates in the tens of thousands of dollars. It moves billions of dollars in raw commodities every single week.
Yeah.
Yet it settles the death of a skilled professional for 10 grand. It entirely exposes the vast, cynical distance between the wealth generated by the cargo and the cheapness of the life tasked with moving it.
$10,000 to compensate a family for the loss of a father, a son, a brother, and they died because of a failure chain they had zero commercial control over.
Exactly.
The DeepDraft makes a very strong argument that India's Directorate General of Shipping cannot just keep managing this crisis through condolences. You can't just issue passive advisory PDFs warning seafarers that certain waters are dangerous.
No, a warning PDF is not a control measure. Telling someone, be careful, while actively allowing them to be routed into a live firing line is a dereliction of duty.
This raises an important question regarding true accountability. The article lays out a blueprint for required cold operational metrics that must form a mandatory war risk disclosure framework.
Yeah.
And I want to explore these not just as a list of rules, but by looking at how a voyage actually comes together for a seafarer.
Okay, let's trace the journey. It starts with recruitment traceability. Imagine an out-of-work seafarer in Mumbai gets a call from a placement agency.
Okay.
The framework demands we ask, which specific RPSL entity, the licensed recruitment service, cleared this man for this exact voyage? And what precise, localized risks were disclosed to him in writing before he signed that waiver under economic pressure?
Wow. And then we move to the second pillar, which is insurance verification. This is a massive loophole in the industry because you might think, oh, it's a commercial ship. Of course it has insurance. But standard marine liability insurance called P&I cover frequently excludes acts of war.
That is the critical mechanism.
Yeah.
To be covered in a war zone, the ship owner has to purchase a specific breach premium. It costs extra money.
Ah. Oh.
So was there verified war risk breach cover for the Settebello? Was the death and disability compensation financially secured and deposited before the crew ever walked up the gangway?
Because if an owner decides to skip buying that war risk cover to save a few $1,000s, they bank that savings in Dubai.
Yeah.
But the fatal exposure of that decision is carried entirely by the crew in the engine room.
Exactly. And that leads directly to the third metric, asset due diligence. Who's actually making money off this voyage?
Yeah.
Before a crew is allowed to board, there needs to be an independent check on the cargo's origin and the beneficial ownership of those hidden shell companies.
Right.
Crucially, was the vessel's OFAC exposure checked? OFAC is the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. They're the ones who enforce economic sanctions. If a vessel is heavily exposed to OFAC sanctions, it becomes a target. Due diligence ensures a civilian crew isn't being unwittingly used as a human buffer to protect illicit trade.
And finally, pipeline accountability. When the system fails, who loses their license? Who specifically authorized Indian nationals to be funneled onto 3 highly compromised hulls in the exact same week?
Exactly.
If a manning agency clears a crew onto a gray fleet vessel without proving they checked the insurance and the OFAC exposure, their operating license shouldn't be reviewed. It should be suspended immediately.
This isn't just a localized issue for India either. It is a global warning. Any country that exports maritime labor needs a verifiable pre-joining control system. If you do not force the people on shore to prove the voyage is financially and legally safe, you are complicit in sending civilians into combat zones blind.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, navigating through the shadows of an industry that touches almost everything we own. To synthesize what we've learned, the tragedy of the MT Settebello was not a noble sacrifice.
No.
It was not unavoidable collateral damage. It was a catastrophic, systemic failure. It was a failure of predatory recruitment agencies, a failure of insurance transparency, and a failure of international military communication.
Yeah.
And that chain of failures ultimately left 3 civilian men dead in a burning engine room, while the people who profited from their voyage sat safely ashore, entirely insulated from the consequences.
Analyzing this event strips away the comforting illusion that the global maritime supply chain is just about moving steel boxes and oil on the water. It forces us to recognize that human beings are carrying the physical weight of global geopolitical risk.
It really is a heavy reality to process. Thank you so much for joining us and exploring this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
But before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder on your own. We've spent a lot of time talking about how cheaply the industry settles death and how much legal and physical risk is hidden within these gray fleet operations.
Right.
So consider this. If the global shipping industry were strictly forced to publicly disclose and fully financially guarantee the actual human risk of every single voyage, if they couldn't hide behind shell companies and they actually had to pay the true multi-million-dollar cost of ensuring those civilian lives properly, how much would the cost of our everyday consumer goods skyrocket? Are you and I unwittingly subsidizing our comfortable, affordable lifestyles through the hidden, lethal dangers faced by these seafarers operating just out of sight? Keep questioning the systems operating around you. We'll see you next time.